What's going on, guys? My name is Tim Ruswick, and today we're going to discuss what an indie game is. Are big companies indie games? Can you really have an indie company that's making millions of dollars? I thought I would answer this question and all these different types of questions because I feel like I am so far, into indie games. We get a couple questions every once in a while from beginners that don't really know what an indie game is. And not only that, but there are a lot of gray areas even after you're into making indie games. You're into making games and you don't know where indie stops and where AAA starts sometimes. So I thought I would share my thoughts. I'm no expert. I'm not the definitive dude to kind of tell you what an indie game is and what it isn't. But I have some opinions, and that's pretty much what I'm going to be sharing in this video. So for the extreme beginners out there, for the people that are just kind of looking into game development, because I know we've been getting a couple of those on the channel, if you're just starting to make your first game, game developers usually we call each other indie game developers. And indie stands for independent. And basically what it means is that you're independent from any kind of publisher and independent from any kind of bigger, larger body. You don't make traditional games. At least that's what it used to mean. Nowadays, it's a little kind of gray because there's a lot of indie games that have publishers. There's a lot of really small single-person games that get published by bigger companies to kind of get the word out there. So what actually is an indie game these days? In my opinion, an indie game is anybody that makes a game with independent creative control over what they create. So, for example, I think if you have a publisher, but you still have complete control over what you're creating and the publisher is going to help you market and push that game out there, I still would consider that an indie game. If instead your publisher says, no, why don't we add some microtransactions in here, or it doesn't even have to be that bad. Why don't we just change this character out to make people, do it, whatever. And if they have a say in that, I wouldn't consider you indie anymore. Not that there's any other kind of, game development out there. You can still be a game developer. Personally, I think once you lose that independent creative control, that's when you stop being indie. Because I think indie is all about experimentation and kind of like uniqueness and kind of coming up with their own identity and taking risks that some of these bigger companies don't take. So if you're new to game development and you want to be an indie game developer, really all you have to start doing is making games. That's pretty much it. You make games, you're an indie game developer. But on the higher end, when you kind of move through things, it gets a little gray, and I would still say a lot of indie games have publishers, and that's totally fine. I don't think that makes them not indie games. I just think that once they give up that independent creative control, once they maybe let other people make the decisions inside their games, I think that's when it kind of stops being indie. But even that is kind of debatable, right? Like, who are we to say when it ends and when it begins? So I think what's really interesting, like, you have indie games these days, indie games with million-dollar budgets, with multi-million-dollar budgets. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. I think there needs to be a good mix of the whole spectrum for these games to kind of, fill out the market and fill out the consumer needs. I think as gamers want as many different choices as they can have, and they want kind of stuff from every genre. And there is a big space in between the solo dude in his bedroom making a game and AAA $500 million budgets. I think there's a big space in between there. And I think it's totally fine for indie games, larger indie games to come out, but I also think it's totally fine for smaller indie games to get a publisher or, make what they want to make. And another thing that I want to say too is I don't think that making a ton of money or being really successful or any of that stuff makes you less indie. Something like, PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, any of these other games that maybe started out somewhat independently, maybe even as mods like PUBG did, once they have massive success, I don't think that makes them less indie. Certainly, at some point, they can take on additional money. They can take on, some kind of publishing contracts, and maybe they lose that independent creative control. And I think at that point, that's when they kind of lose their indie status. Not that it matters. I think overall, indie is just a label. And I think all of us are game developers. I don't think we should think about who's indie and who's not, because ultimately it doesn't matter. We all like to make games, and indie used to be a title, a badge, a label to kind of tell the difference between AAA games and like people in their bedroom that make games. Another title they used to use is homebrew. I used to hear that a lot, homebrew games. I don't really hear that term around anymore. But it's, you know, at the end of the day, we're all game developers. So I wouldn't be worried about who's indie. Is this guy indie? Is he not? Can you call yourself an indie game developer or not? If you make games, you're an indie game developer. Let's just put it that way. If at some point you give up creative control over your project, it probably means you're doing really fucking well. So I wouldn't really worry about title at that point either. Like you've had some success if you've given up creative control at that point, because you probably didn't just give it up for no reason. There was probably other incentives there for you as well. So it's, you know, it's one of those things. But I get asked about this a lot. Got off stream, long stream. But it's one of those things where, you know, I don't think it's really important at all. I like to call myself an indie game developer because I feel like indie game development is like a branding term for me. I feel like saying that we're a group of indie game developers means something different than we're a group of game developers. Because indie is kind of taking on a meaning of its own. And this is the last kind of thing that I want to touch on. So, like, I talk about what it means and what my definition of it is and how it works. And I talked about how I don't really think it's important. But with all that said, there are power in words. And when someone says that they're an indie game developer, when someone says they make indie games, people automatically assume that those games are going to be creative, unique, a little bit crazy, you know. They're going to take risks. They're going to be a little bit out there. So I think that calling your game an indie game has some advantages in the market, to be honest. I think it has a little bit of flair to it. I think it's a good marketing decision because immediately people know how to judge your game based compared to other games. Because let's face it, if gamers play a game like Call of Duty or something, and then they play your game on Steam, and it's a shooter, they're probably going to compare it to Call of Duty. If your shooter is called an indie game, will they still make that comparison? Probably. But I think they're a little more forgiving, and they're looking for something different from an indie game versus a shooter, or versus like an actual game. Like if they think it's made by a full AAA studio that's got large budgets, I think their expectations are a little bit different, if that makes any sense. So the title of indie, I think, can have some marketing benefits, some branding benefits, but I don't think it actually matters for your internal label. I don't. When I see people argue over whether or not a company is indie, that's so pointless. It doesn't get anybody anywhere. Like what? Why does it matter if they're indie or they're not? It's just, you know, we're all game developers at the end of the day, and we all got to help each other out. We all got to make awesome games. And the more that we kind of come together and help each other from all walks of life, from all these different genres, from all these different types of games, I think the more we'll make awesome shit. And that's why I love places like GDC or any of these other events, the online events we did. I spoke at one because I think they're so awesome for bringing people together. And indie or not, you know, game developer or not, I feel like labels matter less than just making games. And that's what we're here to do. So I hope that was enlightening for you. I hope you learned something. If you did, please leave me a comment below. If you got any questions on this, maybe you got an opinion on what makes an indie game developer an indie game developer, leave that down below because I would love to hear from you. Once again, I'm Tim Ruswick, and I will see you again tomorrow.